Welcome, everyone. My name is Rita Soni. I am Principal Analyst for Sustainability and Impact Sourcing at Everest Group. I'm really excited about today's conversation. We're entering into the world of supplier diversity, or maybe some other terms that you like to use, responsible procurement, or other things that you might want to call it. We know that it's demonstrated real win-win practices, both good for business, good for society. And I wanted to start off with two quotes that we have from a couple of companies that I think is really interesting. Every time we've asked for something, our diverse providers have delivered. They're always two steps ahead of us. And this was from a supplier diversity champion at a Fortune 500 health insurance company. And another one that I think is really relevant about the benefits of these practices is the attrition rate of the minority supplier workforce is almost half as much as the traditional workforce. And this was from a leading procurement specialist at a top technology company. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how is it that these benefits of supplier diversity and other ways of operating your procurement teams for your suppliers, your other ways for your suppliers to operate can be beneficial for business as well as for society. Before we get started into the salient points and talking to my esteemed panel here, I want to tell you something special that we're doing with this event. We are planting trees for every single registrant, comment, reaction that you make, so that we can also have an environmental impact while we also discuss, this socially relevant topic. So please do be very generous with your comments and your reactions. So we're starting off with, where are you dialing in from? And I think the reason that's pretty important is because we know this topic is global, including our panel as well. But we also know that there are global firms that are doing things differently in one place than another. So it's really important and interesting to know where people are dialing in from. And keep your eyes peeled for more questions and engagement on comments. So before I get into that one, I want to start introducing my esteemed panel. Chris Gentile, I met first when he was at Google. He was doing some incredible work from the procurement team there, and now he's running his own shop called Glide Lane, which you're going to hear a little bit more about shortly. Kelly Hallard, I met first when she was doing international convenings through the Global Technology and Business Services Organization. I always forget that full name. She's the founder of GSA and has so much great insight and is talking a lot about responsible and socially relevant activities in this sector. And finally, my colleague, Amy Fong, who is a partner here at Everest Group. And she has really been educating me quite a bit on emerging sourcing practices and procurement practices. And I'm really excited to have them here. So just to quickly kick us off, I want to say that we're seeing some really interesting work in supplier diversity. We've seen it over decades. A 2022 statistic from the Billion Dollar Roundtable said that there was over $122 billion in diverse supplier spend. A bunch of studies have talked about supplier diversity, and there's really interesting key statistics. Stuff like Hootology came up with this study where they said 49% of individuals are more likely to ask for Coke because of their diversity efforts. Jaeger said that 68% of organizations are globally increasing their supplier diversity. So not just looking at this practice that started as a US activity. They also said, and then the other one, the business side of this that I really want to get into is Gitnuck said that companies show 133% greater return on procurement investments. And organizations that prioritize supplier diversity spend 20% less on their buying operations. I don't know any of the details about all of these things, but I think there's just a really interesting place to start. And it also lets me know that I'm not drinking my own Kool-Aid. So I would like to get us started with Chris. Why do you think supplier diversity has evolved beyond its origins in the US?
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Everest Group, and thank you, community who have joined us today. And please keep the comments coming so we can plant more trees and give back through this event. I think the fundamentals of supplier diversity, right? It's about the fact that corporate enterprises, corporate supply chains need talent from everywhere. And as we know, talent is evenly distributed everywhere, but opportunity often lags that. And the kinds of marginalizations by, whether it's by gender, which is a global phenomenon, race, creed, caste, geography, access to technology, those kinds of marginalizations are global phenomena. And while, supplier diversity, and I think language is very important these days in an era where language is being attacked, but supplier diversity has been a very specific set of processes, right? But the principles underlying those are real everywhere. Supplier diversity is a global phenomenon today, 50 years on from when it started, because it exists as a process in many countries around the world. We'll hear about that today. But the fundamental principles, which is that enterprises need strong, talented, innovative suppliers to solve problems everywhere, and the fact that marginalizations exist, that is a global phenomenon.
Yeah, this is the conversation you and I have had with regard to impact sourcing. There's excluded communities everywhere, and therefore the opportunities are also everywhere. I love that.
Sure.
All right, before we move to Carrie, who I can't wait to talk to as well, thank you for all the locations. We're really dialing in from a bunch of different places, the UK, India, New York. I have another question for you. Which emoji best describes your view of the current state of responsible procurement and supplier diversity? So now you get to get creative. Hopefully an emoji exists on how you're feeling about it. And while you're thinking about that, let's hear from Carrie. Carrie, how do you think supplier diversity ties into the broader global corporate strategies today, as opposed to, what we saw last year?
Yeah. Well, it's changing, isn't it? It's changing on a pin at the moment. So the timing of this particular LinkedIn Live could not be better. When we were doing the preamble, just testing, we were talking about the fact that the UK Prime Minister is currently in the White House talking to the US President. Goodness knows what they're going to be talking about, but the cut in UK government going to aid is probably on the agenda there, and the increase in defence spending. These big government decisions are going to be having, real ripple effects into, private sector operations in terms of what they're doing with their DEI agendas, what they're doing with their supplier diversity initiatives, and what they're actually doing with their impact sourcing. So thank you very much, Everest, for bringing this conversation to the table at this time and giving us the opportunity to really reinforce how absolutely important supplier diversity is. Now, obviously, we're not going to get political. That's not what this is about, but actually to reinforce that for organisations all around the world, supplier diversity, inclusive sourcing, inclusive procurement is all about inclusive growth for everyone. So it's growth for those organisations that are actually working with diverse suppliers, as well as growth for those diverse suppliers themselves. But most importantly, it's growth for and advancement for those communities, the people that are actually working for those diverse suppliers and those communities that have knock-on, positive impacts from these communities having employment that is given to them by these diverse suppliers. So that's obviously the kind of headline. ESG was a huge agenda item last year. It's not such a huge agenda item as the term ESG, but hopefully the substance within ESG will continue to remain absolutely huge. For me at the Global Sourcing Association, we're all about the buying of technology and business services. We're about the services industry, and that's a people industry. So for us, the social piece within ESG has always been really, really, really important. And then if you look at the social piece, that really looks at workplace, well-being in the workplace, DEI in the workplace. It also obviously plays really importantly to equality in the workplace, you know, gender pay equality, fair pay, social value, impact sourcing, and supply chain diversity. So I truly, truly hope that although the terminology might change, the ongoing focus on the importance of all things ESG will continue. So.
I love the optimism. I love it, Carrie. And I'm with you. I think you're right. And thanks everyone for starting to put in some emojis. I wondered if we weren't as quick on the finger on it because we're not Gen Z, but I am seeing some interesting reactions. The prayer hands for sure, the hand as well, or look. So as you keep thinking about what emojis are describing how you're feeling about it, Amy, I'd love you to get us started now on really talking about the global trends. So what would you say is the biggest trends shaping supplier diversity around the globe?
Sure. So I think I want to go back to a couple things because I think that there's a lot of, Chris made the point that this has been around for 50 years in the US, right? Nothing here is new. This isn't a 2020 decision. And I think that there's a lot of baby bathwater happening and acronyms that are getting thrown around without a lot of understanding of what's really important behind them. The fundamental reason that supplier, there's probably multiple reasons, but I wasn't doing this 50 years ago, but close to it. The fundamental reasons that supplier diversity was introduced was because there are these talent pools that businesses need to access, and businesses that need help to access these big companies spend, right? So veteran-owned businesses, of course, minority-owned businesses, people from underprivileged communities, but also small businesses of, regardless of ownership, just the fact that they needed to be given special attention to be able to compete and grow and serve big companies. And one of the challenges I've seen big companies talk about now, if you sit down with supply chain people, with the convergence of all of these large suppliers, you're narrowing your options in the supply chain, you're narrowing your pool of suppliers. And as much as we wanted to consolidate vendors for cost savings, that adds quite a bit of risk. So part of building up our talent pool and building up our supply base is finding ways to access suppliers, providers that come from, that might be smaller, that are pulling talent in the case of services from, populations that didn't have an advantage. This isn't about capabilities. This is about finding the most capable suppliers that might be not having the opportunity to get in front of you because you're such a large company. And I think that, there's been a lot of that activity in the US. It was a lot about community development. It's also been a lot about, how do we find these small suppliers and help develop them, help give them a capacity to grow with us, to meet our needs. They are more agile. They're more able to bring in new technologies to the business faster and support their clients, their customers faster. So I think there's a lot of good. And that, somebody mentioned fully inclusive approach. And I think that's really important. Not about necessarily separating groups, but about having a fully inclusive approach. This is about access and opportunity, right? There's nothing about access and opportunity that takes away the merit part of choosing a supplier. It's the fact that you might not even know these suppliers exist because they're small and they have trouble getting through your onboarding process because it takes 6 months. That's been a common challenge. So I think it's important to think about that. And when I think about it as a global thing, because I know this was a global question. I want to get back to your question, Rita. What I've seen over the last several years is different countries acknowledging that they have these pools of suppliers that they, in companies, businesses, that they want to help give equal opportunity to. They want to help raise them up. And the definition of who those companies are, who the ownership might be, who the workforce might be, it differs country to country, because we all have a different history, right? So in Australia, efforts to access Aboriginal-led companies and businesses has been around for a long time. This is not new, right? And it's done for good reason, because there's great things being done in those communities that's not on the radar screen of the big corporates. So I think we're going to go back to fundamentals on that. What I'd love to talk about more today, and I'm excited to hear what Chris and Carrie have, because they're really immersed, is what are the things that help you be successful as a business, right? How do you do that? How do you access that that talent, the capabilities, find those companies and build up? Because this is not just about awarding business to those who aren't capable or don't deserve it. This is about finding more suppliers that can de-risk your company, can bring in additional talent, can bring in additional technologies and capabilities, and growing that you have a more robust portfolio of suppliers.
100%. But I think that your comment leads straight into what Carrie was going to tell us about, in terms of how are non-US companies defining and implementing supplier diversity specifically. Yeah, Carrie, and I think this is getting to what Jason's comment that we had up a moment ago is getting into. So yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that we founded, actually, I'm a co-founder of the Council for Supplier Diversity and Inclusion in the UK. And that was set up post-pandemic around 2021 by a number of like-minded individuals. So from my perspective, I come from the background of technology and business services, and I was incredibly frustrated by how difficult it was for small technology providers to get a foot in the door at enterprise buyers. Really, really difficult, that even if they got the foot in the door, it was actually getting over the line because of all the complexities, the liability provision requirements, due diligence requirements, and things like that. So with a couple of other like-minded individuals, we co-founded the Council for Supplier Diversity and Inclusion, because there's no best practice in the UK. This was set up by some people that are very experienced in supplier diversity in the US, but they couldn't do the lift and shift model. So the way it's set up in the UK is it's very much a nice thing to have, rather than being a compliance-led initiative. So in the UK, the government has no formal categorisation of diverse suppliers. So the British government recognises SMEs, and we recognise social enterprises. And of course, a lot of diverse suppliers sit within the SME category. But other than that, we don't actually formally categorise the diversity of our suppliers. You go over to France, and you cannot categorise diverse suppliers. It is absolutely not allowed. And that's under GDPR, it's under the French anti-discrimination laws, under lots of different reasons. But the privacy over there is really, really, really tight. Another issue we've got, if you look at diversity of veteran-owned businesses. The individual as a veteran is not a, what do we call it? We call it a protected category of individual, let alone as a recognised diverse sort of supplier status. So we've got all these different things going on, and no best practices. So we set up to start the best practices in the UK, and I think we've made some really good inroads. So I see a couple of friendly faces that were sat on a panel in at a GSA event at the end of last year, where the NGOs are really, really beginning to collaborate. They're working together so that there is absolutely this agreement that it shouldn't be picking which diversity do you want to back, which is what had been happening, historically. It's actually about promoting the bigger purpose and the bigger benefits of working across diverse suppliers. So although we're not anywhere near as mature and our best practices are still emerging, and the size of certified diverse suppliers. I'm quoting now Scott from Veteran UK. I think he said that less than or more than 95% of diverse suppliers in the UK are not actually certified, and there isn't one central certification database that buyers can go to select diverse suppliers from. So although we're behind in that way, I think there is actually an opportunity for us to potentially take some of the learnings from what's actually happened in the US and potentially leapfrog. So, you know, we can actually look at the definitions of what is the definition of a diverse supplier. We get caught up with this 51% owned and operated biodiversity. But we were talking about a really great example the other day. What happens if you've got a business that's got 3 owners and operators? You know, one being a veteran, the other being ethnic minority, and the other being female. They cannot be certified to any diversity, yet clearly they're 100% a inclusive, diverse business. So we are beginning to grapple with these sort of subjects and going, actually, I think we could probably do this a little bit differently in the UK and change things up a little bit.
Yeah, I think I just want to comment on that, Carrie, because I've said this for a very long time, well before 2020, that I think there's reasons that ownership was the guiding principle in the US and the defining aspect, but I think that it misses a lot. And I actually, you know, the comments that the change, you know, the new trend is approaching from access to all different groups. There have been a lot of companies that have been doing that for a long time. So I think we're, you know, there's some that weren't, you know, that were very focused on certain metrics. Anytime you put metrics, people work to the metrics. But the idea of looking at the diversity of the workforce or the population of the workforce and I'm using diversity very broadly here, right? The makeup of a company and the talent in it and how you're helping a community and all of that. There's been some really good companies that have been doing that for a very long time. And I want to acknowledge that because there's a lot of highlighting the bad right now. And I think you know, there's so much good that can be done. And Carrie, I love what you said about, you know, thinking about, it's not just ownership. Ownership may still be there, but what are the other things we need to look at as well to really meet the mission that we're focused on? I think I'm happy to hear that being talked about at this point. It's been my little soapbox for a while.
Yeah, it absolutely has to be looking at the composition of the organisations, not just the ownership, and the impact it's actually having across their diverse communities. So there's an opportunity for us to develop new standards, new best practices, because we are still so embryonic in the UK. You know, nobody knows how to report their supplier diversity. Some organisations are reporting it on, well, if we look at the number of suppliers we got, 52% of them are SMEs. But then what percentage of spend is that actually with your diverse suppliers? So until people start sharing these data sets, it's really hard to understand who's actually doing supplier diversity well. So sharing targets, changing the way organisations set targets, all of these things are things that we're looking at setting new sort of like frameworks around to do things a little bit differently. You know, having targets that actually diverse suppliers should always be in the RFP. Can we create clauses to ensure that, you know, there's really clear language about how you include diverse suppliers when you actually go to market? You know, and it's not just in the RFP, it's within the business for buying things that are below the procurement clip point, you know, which is where a lot of the spend with diverse suppliers is. So it's kind of, reinventing a few wheels to do things differently, but at the same time, obviously, picking up all the brilliant best practice that's been going on in the US and around the world for years as well.
Great conversation, Amy and Carrie, and 100% agree with everything you've said, especially as it relates to impact sourcing. So I want to move into some specifics. so that we give our audience not just the 50,000 feet, but we actually give some sense of what we've actually seen. Chris, could you get us started on sharing some successes that you've seen in this space, be it supplier diversity or any of these concepts of inclusion or impact and win-win situations?
Yeah, certainly, and maybe we'll try to to contribute and respond to some of the wonderful points that Karen and Amy just surfaced. I think I think at a time when clearly there's enormous economic, political, technological disruption, it is the right time for corporations to think about what responsible buying looks like writ large, right? To build on some of those best practices and maybe start to use all of the arrows we have in our quiver, right? So thinking not just about supplier diversity, but about the workforce and other indicators inside of our suppliers, that our supply chains are representative, that we're sourcing from everywhere, sustainable, et cetera. And so I think that's a really important conversation to have. I know that in terms of success stories, and I can speak to my own experience having created Google Supplier Diversity Program, having launched Google Supplier Diversity Program in 2014. That as a company that at the time was like, really, how do we think globally and more broadly about how we do this? We approach supplier diversity as really we need to get right what communities are expecting and have asked us to do on supplier diversity, kind of as table stakes into a larger conversation, right? So we can measure the fact that that supply chains across enterprise are less representative than, when we look at gender specifically. When we look at gender globally, there was a famous McKinsey study about 6-7 years ago that said we're leaving $12 trillion of GDP on the table, right, by not including women-owned and founded businesses in the global supply chain. That is an enormous waste of talent, right? So how do we think about creating equity by finding and tapping talent in those communities? And by doing so, and I think supplier diversity has always worked well when we are thinking about letting more folks into the tent, right? It's not about creating ghettos of suppliers in different corners. It's about bringing more folks into the process. Carrie mentioned, some of those practices. Can we make sure we always have diverse-owned, diverse-founded businesses in RFP processes and at every stage of the sourcing pipeline? Those kind of practices that I helped implement at Google meant we were spending billions annually with certified diverse suppliers in really critical areas, right? And I do want to make a distinction. Supplier diversity does not equate to small businesses, right? It equates to businesses across the spectrum, which looks like what our supply chains look like, right? Companies have really critical suppliers who are small, sometimes really small, and who are really large. And diverse suppliers are both small and really large, and play roles across things like, for my old company and in the tech industry, data center, construction and management, IT solutions, product development, right? The stuff that goes into tech products, the stuff that goes into retail products, extending our workforce, professional services, the most critical procurement areas of a company. I think it's funny, ironically, I think many of the companies who have actually been in the news for sort of rolling back initiatives around DEI and sometimes supplier diversity are companies that I know are getting tons of actual value, procurement value, out of supplier diversity. And I think that's because when folks are doing supplier diversity really, really well, they're usually doing core procurement functions really well. They're sourcing. Procurement is, this was mentioned earlier, procurement is often pretty bad at sourcing and sourcing value-adding suppliers. And doing supplier diversity well forces a practice in that's really strong. Looking at Carrie mentioned earlier, risk, sourcing with attention to risk. Procurement's often really bad at this, but fostering relationships, engaging suppliers, sometimes over years, can really help mitigate any kinds of risk that might come up, whether it's business, financial risk, et cetera. And then looking at internal business partnerships, supplier diversity often fosters really strong partnerships between actual buyers in the organization, business leaders in the organization, and procurement teams. And so that's really how we do things well. I've shared, we can share with you the principles that Glide Lane brings into sustained supplier diversity, but it's really around this. Like, we need an equity orientation, and we need to really do the things that procurement sometimes doesn't do so well. Supplier diversity can help procurement do really well.
Yeah, I think that's great, Chris. And yes, thank you for clarifying. It's not just small, because I was kind of over probably making that point, because I think that it also gets confused with, you're giving deals to people because of their race, and that's certainly not what's happening. So I want to be really clear that there's a lot of different types of diversity. But I think, to your point, that some of the businesses, even the ones that are scaling back now, have gotten a ton of value from this over the years. And in some cases, I think have done it well enough that those companies, right, the companies that helped build the data centers at Google that were diverse owned, at some point, it's just so embedded in the business that you forget that it took a lot of work to get to that in the first place.
Correct. And those kinds of relationships and supplier diversity across often start from a place of, well, these are protected and really special areas of our supply chain. So obviously, we're all only going to use our most trusted, most capable partners. And there's, of course, a bias embedded in that, right? That assumes that that diverse owned suppliers can't fulfill those functions. Over time, when the business and procurement and supplier diversity are working together, you break down those biases and realize in the most important areas of our operation, is exactly where we need the most innovation and the most talent for everywhere, which means we need to be looking everywhere. We need to be asking hard questions of our embedded suppliers. And sometimes that means we bring in new suppliers to deal with those core functions.
Yeah, that's so true. And I want to comment on that a little bit, because there are some questions about AI and stuff too. And I think as we see technology changing, one of the things that are evolving, it's always changing. To your point, one of the things that sourcing has really had to work at is bringing in new suppliers for anything, right? So every time we have a new opportunity or new business, we don't go out and look at the same 3 providers or 3 suppliers and do an RFP to the same 3. And often supplier diversity just means adding 5 more to understand their capabilities, right? And in many cases, diverse suppliers are great opportunities to do that. They're great candidates because they might be smaller, they might be, more interested in developing to fit your business, more flexible. There's a lot of data that I've seen in my past life of doing research that really backed up what Rita was saying about high satisfaction. I think that what I've seen from in the global services space in the last few years is this need to introduce specialist suppliers. It's a pretty consolidated space. There are 25-ish big firms for outsourcing that Everest Group follows, and we follow thousands of others. But those 25 have a lot of market share, and bringing in new types of providers, new talent, just finding others that can do that kind of work is really, really important. And I think that this is one way. So Ankur, on your question about reducing human labor, I think it's still a priority, but AI isn't just about cost cutting and automation. I think that who's providing the AI, who's helping you do that, like supplier diversity plays along with that pretty well, I think.
100%. And I think Peter had a good comment in reaction to Ankur's question, because it's not just about less labor, but it's about deprioritizing cost cutting. And so I think putting a higher priority on supplier diversity accomplishes what you both were saying, me and Chris, that it gives, you know, what Peter is also talking about here. It gives you more options, and it gets you closer to all of the different stakeholders that you need to be working with. So
yeah, and supplier discovery tools can really help with that, and they can benefit from AI to help find those suppliers as well. And
which there's a booming market, right? In, of course, in procurement AI.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, any conversation around AI, right, we can go to extremes and talk about, you know, doom and gloom. And we can talk about also how, wow, we're leveling the playing field. I think there is a window and a real interesting moment in generative AI right now, where the access to tools, sometimes low code tools, right, can help diverse suppliers create an edge, and enter, you know, parts of, you mentioned specialized procurement, parts of our procurement chain that have previously been kept to just a few companies. I'm seeing that now. We're bringing diverse-led, venture-backed, AI-enabled companies whom corporate procurement organizations have never heard of before, but who are doing really powerful things as relatively small companies, in the supplier sustainability space, in the supplier risk space, working with a company, Construe, based out of the UK, who with a AI agent is really changing how companies can take and automate really hard tasks that are, you know, very admin heavy, and really automate those and creating ways, right? And there are companies like those in this moment that are at a premium for any companies who are in this economic moment looking to reduce costs, become more efficient, right? They need to do more with less, especially in support functions, like procurement and HR. And so this is a moment where I think, again, supplier diversity can be a real benefit to companies who are thinking about it strategically.
Can I just chime on in there, really? So I'm just really going back. I think it brings it all together a little bit to what Amy was saying about obviously looking at the tier one service providers. I find in the tier one service providers and doing a lot more collaboration with diverse providers now. Some of these really cool technologies where they're not trying to reinvent wheels, but they're bringing cool AI into their own portfolios. And I think that's becoming really critically important. We've done a good job measuring scope 3 emissions. We need to be doing a much better job of measuring scope 3 diversity in supply chains. So it's something that it's actually very timely. It's just this week that the UK's Public Procurement Act has gone live. And we've actually increased targets there that it was 25%, it's now 33% of all UK government spend needs to be with, unfortunately not diverse, but we say small suppliers or social enterprises. But that can be either direct or indirect spend. So this whole focus on, you know, how much spend is with diverse suppliers within your own supply chain and actually having visibility of that is becoming incredibly important and gives great opportunity, I think. So,
Carrie, there are a number of
and that's a great point, Carrie. And one of the really helpful tools. One of the helpful tools that we've put out into the market at Everest Group is a list of diverse suppliers, specifically for the global services industry, as well as a list of impact sourcing specialist companies. So those where their primary talent strategy is impact sourcing. So you'll see a couple of links. Sorry for them looking a little confusing there, but hopefully you'll get it. And then, you know, I think it also would be nice for us to post the company that Chris mentioned. What is it called?
Construe.
Construe. Okay, thank you. All these made up words, hard to figure out how to say them. Yeah, I think there's just a tremendous number of resources. And I think I'm also glad that our chat is seeing some conversation and not just questions to us, which we're going to get to the questions as well. But I think, commenting on each other's and putting out some examples and frameworks, I think that's really, really interesting. I want to get back to our agenda, but before we do that, I really liked Peter's question that we had thrown up there for a second, and we can maybe pull it back up. In terms of the actual measurement, the social measurements that show why it is that working with these different suppliers is useful. And I think that, and I'd love everyone's input on this, but I think what everyone is starting to understand in business is the challenges that development has had over the generations, which is actually showing measurable impact. But the benefit of this is there are real jobs, real incomes that people are earning, et cetera. So I think this is not a question of what are the measurements. It's a question of how do we publicize and make more folks aware of all of these business benefits, that it's not just the Kool-Aid I was talking about earlier. Chris, I see you nodding your head. So yeah, please.
Absolutely. This is a conversation that I've been involved in for as long as I've been in supplier diversity. And I do see, I know that Everest has done some work on this. I do see more attention paid to the economic impact reporting. So, to the question, for instance, in 2023, NMSDC, the U.S. minority certifying body, in their economic impact report, they published, yes, the top line that their certified MBEs had a combined $360+ billion of revenue, but they also published along with that those certified diverse-owned organizations drove over 1 million jobs, and the increase, I think it was like a 5-point increase on a 2-year, year-over-year basis, something like $85 billion in wages by those employees. I'm reading now, $57 billion in taxes inside the U.S., double-digit increase, right? So these are real impacts. I think we also have studied the fact that in minority communities in the U.S., for example, that diverse-owned business leaders are more likely to hire other diverse-owned employees. Women were more likely to hire women leaders in positions of leadership or authority. And so there is that impact, that effect through the enterprise of supplier diversity. So the top line, right, how much does your corporation spend with a diverse-owned business is a proxy that we don't always think is a terrific proxy, but we do see the impact throughout the organizations of their hiring, their economic impact, and their community economic impact.
This is why I like talking about impact sourcing, because it's so direct. Yes. I've seen a lot of these specialists actually convey, we've paid out X thousands of dollars in a year's time in salaries to this community, and then how that follows on to a particular group. So yes.
Yeah.
All right.
One thing I learned early in supply chain, and this is from my spouse who works in apparel supply chain, right? He would say we would start in a community and everybody would be sort of riding bikes to work. And then you go back and a few years later, people have motorbikes and cars, and they have options and access to capital and access to resources and education and childcare that they didn't have before, right? And that kind of impact is a lot of what this is all about, right? Getting, that can be good or bad, but trying to do it in good ways that brings up that community and empowers them to own how they are using their resources. So I think there's sort of an underlying theme there that benefits everybody. It sounds really squishy when you think about it that way, but I think in reality, you can measure that impact. These are quantitative things, right? There's a lot of quantitative ways to measure the impacts to communities. That should be the output, the outcome that we're measuring beyond just, some of the very easier, like how many suppliers did we award business to, kind of metrics that tend to get be easier to measure. Yeah. Chris, I know you want to say something on that.
Well, Amy, right. It can be squishy, and I think we need to work hard to make it not squishy and hard.
100%.
I work with a business that was founded and led by a Black women-owned founder in the United States called COI Energy, and they give back. They're an energy exchange platform for large enterprise, but they give back in kilowatt hours to those who are energy insecure, and we can measure, right, the dollar value of what those kilowatt hours are giving back to communities where folks are economically insecure in many ways. And that comes from a founder who grew up in an economically insecure and an energy insecure environment, right? And so those founders who have stories, right, who maybe didn't grow up in privilege in those ways, are at that scale to give back in ways that we should do a much better job of measuring. But Rita, to your word, publicizing. We have these metrics. We do need to be sharing the stories. In Jason, your comment, right, in the exact spirit of that comment, which is like, let's share exactly what those impacts have been.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think that's a great point. I would challenge everyone who's on here, because I think when we talked about like what's gone bad in the past, several years and what the good is, I think it's very easy as companies to put something on a scorecard that is a halfway metric, not an outcome, but a symptom, a good symptom, and really get fixated on that number instead of really striving to find the right way to measure these outcomes. Because the impact is real, it is quantitative, it can be measured. Sometimes it's a little harder to measure, but I think that when we going back to that point early on about what's next, what are the trends? The trend is to really find that impact, share the stories, find ways to measure it, even if it's a little bit harder, but make it real, right? And that may not be about compliance. That may be about doing what your company wants to do at the corporate level, what your suppliers can do. Like Chris, that's a great example of something that that supplier uniquely can offer. And it's real, it's tangible, it's positive. It's going to be different and harder for different for every supplier, and thus harder to put on a scorecard, but it's the right thing to do to make this real.
Just getting back to what Carrie said about the UK recognizing social enterprises, I think that's where this conversation around terminology, that's a really great expansion to my mind in thinking about terminology. And I think it also gets to this question that we just got from, I'm not sure who it is, it just says LinkedIn user for me, but saying that, about supplier transparency and honesty, and that we have tech tools that are going to help with doing that. And I think there's more and more, we know ESG data and all the reporting conversations that we're having is a big conversation and a big thing to solve for. But I also see that that's also going to be part of this conversation. It's, are you a social enterprise? What kind of different certifications do you have? B Corp may be the be all and end all of this, that they're in the end the ones that are allowing for this kind of level of transparency and actually demonstrating impact.
Yeah.
To this user, I'll add another element to this question, which is around bias that can be built into tools and technology. So I'll add a question without an answer, right? But how do we ensure that the tools that we begin to adopt, especially as AI begins to decrease sometimes the transparency of how we know something, how do we ensure that we can eliminate bias in those tools and ensure that we can effectively rank and assess risk from supplier talent everywhere?
Yeah, that's a great point.
I'd like to take a quick pause in our Q&A, as well as even our very long agenda, because I don't think we're going to finish that in 10 minutes. But I wanted to take a quick pause and let everyone that has dialed in know that we have a special offer to those that are dialing in. Anyone that has dialed in and is interested in learning more about how our analysts are thinking about diverse suppliers, impact sourcing, the couple of directories that we published here, how to get into those directories, how to have access to those directories. We're excited. We do these things because we want more conversation around this. I think more visibility and more awareness is what we need. So please do reach out. It's a specific ask and an offer that we're giving to those that are participating today. So I think we've posted that. I think I do want to go back to our agenda a tiny bit and just talk a little bit more about what we think the expansions are in supplier diversity. I think we've touched on this quite a bit already in the conversation, Carrie. We've talked a lot about impact sourcing, one of our favorite topics. What do you think is what more is going to happen in terms of the evolving frameworks on how to create a more inclusive society and how to make this work for more people?
Gosh, I think we've covered a lot of it already, really. And it's great that there is this really strong desire for an intersection between not just what are the benefits of supplier diversity to the corporates, and I've got some great examples where corporates really have benefited for themselves, but actually having, maybe it's something we can collaboratively work on, is how do we actually agree to measure the benefits for the communities themselves. It would be great to have. There's something, again, I keep referring back to different things that we've got in the UK. In the UK, we've got the Social Value Act, and we've got a social value calculator. And it's a very complicated calculator to work out the value of different aspects of social value that's been created. But maybe it's something we could collectively work on to actually look at how do we measure the value across communities delivered through supplier diversity. But going back to the conversation before, it is having people willing to share their success stories, to share their failures as well, what they're doing wrong, or what they've trialed and didn't actually work, is just as valuable as obviously sharing what they're doing well, and sharing targets. That's something I referred to earlier. What does good really look like in any given type of company, and what do good return on investments actually look like in any given type of similar diverse supplier program? So yeah,
I love that. Yeah, and I think it's actually getting to the question that Lauren Hampton asked as well, albeit with a global lens, that talking about the things that have worked, looking not just at outputs, but really what have the outcomes been, what are your actual OKRs in this program, and then even sharing some of the failures and how you've overcome some of those failures is really important. I think, Lauren, another add to what we're seeing is, in fact, we really wanted this to be a global conversation and not really focus on what's happening in the U.S. But in prep for this, we did see that what's happened in the U.S. and this actually goes to a little bit of Ramesh's question as well. We see two camps that have come about. We do see a lot of very public boycotts. We're seeing even some very public expansions and doubling down. We're seeing some companies nuancing their response and saying, we're going to do this in the United States, but for the rest of the world, we're going to do something else. And more specifically to the question of specific targets on supplier diversity, that's been a little bit more in the middle, that there's not necessarily a lot of public discourse or public commentary on we're cutting that target or we aren't cutting that target. You know, there's just, it's sort of still maybe wait and see in some of those instances. So I think for those that are advocates, I think focusing in on the positive and those that are trying to do some interesting things in these very turbulent times could be one avenue. Amy, I think you and I have talked a lot about this, kind of focusing on the good, but do you have some other suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll see this play out. There's a lot of noise in the system right now, right? And a lot of just a lot of companies that don't want to get caught in the crosshairs of back and forth. I mean, look at the internet and social media right now, and you know, no matter what they say, they feel like they're going to get attacked, and that's not worth it for them. Not that they don't think the purpose is worth it, but just the public statement isn't worth it. I think we'll get through that time. I think that in the meantime, there are still a lot of people out there doing good things, and they are focusing on the impact that they have in their supply base and in their communities. I think if you're focusing on things like giving opportunity to more suppliers, if you're focusing on the outcomes and the impact that those suppliers make, and in some ways expanding the aperture, impact sourcing, for instance, that's about the workplace, the workforce, and the communities that you're reaching. I think if you're doing all of those things and you're really thinking through how you can do more of that, ways to measure that, you're on the right track. When the dust settles, those are the things that are going to make us better humans, and that are probably going to make you a better company. I do think that those will make you a better company. So none of those conflict really with any of the mud being slung, because they're just like the obvious business things to do for business reasons. So I'm really interested to hear Carrie and Chris's response to that as well. So.
Yeah, I'm in league with all of that, and just think that this is a time to really open up how responsible procurement has lasting and sustainable impact. I think Lauren's question, and Lauren is a great leader in this space, while optimistic, right, gets to how tough a time folks are having right now in certain places. But Carrie's point around, you know, we're doing this globally, and can we figure out how to, you know, essentially, like, what are the sustainable development goals around responsible procurement, right, that include impact sourcing, that include supplier diversity, right, and other ways to ensure that we're sourcing and grabbing talent from everywhere. You know, supplier diversity, which I deeply respect, has gotten too clubby over the years, right? And the membership needs to open up, because it's not really including enough of the most talented, the most technology forward, the most innovative companies, and it's not really serving always the needs of corporations. But I think, Rita, we don't hear corporations calling out supplier diversity too much explicitly, because it is often really working, and it often really is an embedded part of the buying and the business partnering process across organizations. But we need to open it up. We need to not have it be clubby. We need to, in fact, bring more people into the tent than fewer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the comment that we got from David Hackett right early on in our conversation. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a great summary of the benefits and the logic and the business case. I know we just have a couple of minutes. I wanted to give all our panelists a minute to just kind of wrap up. And what's your big takeaway? What do you have a new emoji when you think about this space after doing this conversation? I don't want to catch you in a cough, Carrie, but I was about to start with you.
Yeah, sorry, I have been coughing. I'm trying to cough on mute all the time, so I hope you have timed that okay. Roundup is, I really like this idea of us working globally on some best practices. I think that would be fabulous. But I think really going back to where we're actually at in the UK, I don't want it to be clubby, and I fear there is a chance of it actually becoming clubby. So that's a big takeout to all of the UK guys on the LinkedIn is, let's not make this clubby. Let's make this massively interactive. You know, let's share. There's already a degree, unfortunately, it's just the way it's grown, of the NGOs competing for the corporate purse. You know, who's going to sponsor their conferences and things like that, and people choosing which diversity. I think we've nipped that in the bud, and we have now got collaboration across the NGOs, which is fantastic. And I think we need to carry on doing that and work collaboratively together, NGOs, businesses, diverse suppliers, all pushing the envelope to push us further. But I think, yeah, I think we've got to be realistic back in the UK as well. We can't boil the ocean. And, you know, we need to, you know, small steps, baby steps are making big strides really for us at the end of the day. So, and I think it's really, really got to be a top-down imperative. This has really got to be a mission that still comes absolutely from the top of businesses and push it all the way through their organizations, that they're really, really behind it. So it's a shout out to the C-suite that, you know, we need your backing to really make this happen. So that's the points there.
Thanks, Carrie. Chris?
Yeah, look, we're on another cycle of the DEI roller coaster, you know, which I've written about at glidelane.blog. And if you've been in the battle around civil rights, around justice, around racial equity for more than a minute, you've been on one of these cycles. And I think what really smart people do in down cycles like this is, one, they take care of themselves and they make sure to engender and foster that energy that brought them into this work. And two, I think they get to work, right? My emojis right now, I put your, whatever your favorite construction emoji is in here, a hammer, the jackhammer, the shovel, like, let's do the work now to prepare for that upcycle. You know, unfortunately, those upcycles happen when tragedies happen in the world and crises happen, but we will remember, right, that as Dr. King said, you know, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and we need to do the right work. I'm spending my time bringing AI tools into a space that's been devoid of any kinds of good technology tools, as supplier diversity has. I'm really excited about that, but I think each of us needs to do what we're uniquely talented in doing at this time when it's time to get back to work.
Get that hard hat on.
That's
I
right.
love it. Amy.
Yeah, I love that. Chris is getting me all psyched up, and I'm more feeling much more motivated. Honestly, I think that when to that point of the construction, right, when cycles go this way, it's a reminder to go back to the fundamentals and reset, right? And I mean, Rita, you and I have talked for the 5+ years I've known you about, you know, procurement people don't really know what impact sourcing is, or yeah, you know, there are things that are being done that are good. I'd never say that supplier diversity, you know, was wrong or shouldn't have been done, but there are better ways that we could be thinking about this. We could be improving on this. And I think that I'm feeling really good, even with other conversations I've had in the last week or two, of those that get it saying, look, maybe not everything was perfect and things were swinging to focus too much on certain metrics and not enough on other opportunities. And I think that you can use this time to force yourself to re-energize and think creatively about what we need to do. Chris using, you know, AI to improve the way we do this, looking at you know, what should the scorecard really be, and what are all the different, it's not one metric, there's a lot of different ways to measure this, and how do we measure the hard stuff. So I feel a bit like there's some optimism in challenge, and I think in the end it'll all work out to a better program and a better way of thinking about this, especially for procurement teams that had, you know, some of the supplier diversity people have worked really hard and are feeling really rough right now. But I do believe that there's a role that we can all play as we start to reset on what the focus and the outcomes need to be.
I think we should circle back before year end and take stock on what all has actually happened once all the shakeout happens. Because I feel optimism and hard hats and steel-toed shoes being worn in this conversation, as well as the virtual part of this conversation. I really appreciate everyone joining us and appreciate all the great inputs. We'll talk soon.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Thanks,
Rita.
Rita.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Both
Cheers,
of you, thank you so much.